What is the cloud?
Okay, so great question, and there's a joke around, and the joke is that there's no such thing as the cloud, it's just somebody else's computer. And there's a lot of truth to that. So really the cloud is just a large collection of computers. And what that gives us is two things. Number one is when you put a lot of computers together and you put a layer on top of that, and by a layer I mean software layer, you can do things that we couldn't do before, because a lot of computers together working as a single computer can do incredible things. The second thing is a really practical thing, and that means that we can share the power of those computers. So when we need the power, we've got it, and we only pay for it when we need it, and when we don't need it and someone else needs it, they can use it at the time. So it has the ability to reduce costs, and also it's good for the environment. A lot of people ask where the cloud is, and really there are large collections of computers in centres we call data centres, and those data centres are all over the world. They're in all sorts of different places, but they tend to be just a large building that contain a lot of servers, and they're located in various geographic places. There's a few that Microsoft have in Australia, and there are some overseas and so on. So that's really all the cloud is.
So it's about as far from being a cloud as possible.
It's not really up there, it's very much on the ground at the moment.
And where did the name Azure come from?
Azure, so actually nobody really knows, but what we think it was is Azure is the colour of blue. It's a special colour of blue, and Azure was a colour that was used in paintings many, many years ago to paint a beautiful blue sky. It was a word for a particular kind of blue. And what we think maybe is that the cloud kind of conjures up ideas of rain and storm, which doesn't make people feel very good. Whereas Azure is really a nice blue, sunny day, a nice blue sky. So we think that's where it came from, but nobody's really 100% sure.
Well, let's go with that for now.
Why not?
And so what are some of the industries in Australia or internationally really starting to do with that cloud computing power?
Great, so great question, and almost every industry is using the cloud in some way. Things like health research, so research into cancer and genomics and that kind of research requires vast amounts of data and vast amounts of computing power. So the kind of power that you can get from the cloud are the type of things that we couldn't do before simply because we didn't have that many computers available to use. In finance, they're using that to predict what might happen with prices and interest rates and to look at bigger picture things like that. And also in education, for example, looking at vast numbers of student outcomes. So how are students doing across the world in various subjects, and looking at the results of the testing and things like that they're doing to try and start to understand what things affect whether a student does well or not. So almost every industry is applying the cloud in some way or other.
So you made mention there is a place for the cloud in education.
Sure.
What are some of the key workloads that you tend to see in education?
Certainly. So, I mean, if we're looking at the big things, it would be sort of what I said before. So the idea that being able to look at large amounts of data about how teachers are teaching and how students are learning around the world, we can start to get much better insights into what really works for students and to tailor education to those needs. On a more practical level, it's simply about perhaps getting the servers out of schools. So being able to give schools the power to run things on servers and on computers without taking up the space or the overhead or the headache of actually having to physically run computer servers on their school premises and in rooms and in the school.
Sounds like there's some financial benefits to leveraging the cloud, but what other value from a business justification standpoint do you see in schools and institutions leveraging it?
Sure, so there's a couple of things. The first one would be that schools are naturally quite peaky, and what we mean by that is there are times in the year when they're very busy and they need a lot of computing power. For example, at the beginning of the school year, when you've got all the new students starting, all sorts of schools need a lot of computing power to get those kids registered, to set them up, to put them into learning management systems, to do all sorts of things like that. But there are times during the year where they need virtually no computing power at all. So during school holidays, for example, there's no need for much computing power, if any. So really, if you buy a bunch of computers or you buy some servers in your school, you're paying for those all year, and when they wear out, and you've got to replace them. With the cloud, what that means is you could spend virtually nothing during the school holidays because you're not using those services. But when you need more more power, like when the kids come back to school, for a short period of time, you can use way more computing power and produce better results administration-wise.
Are there concerns that schools have around moving to the cloud and having their information or their workloads sit outside of their own remit?
Yeah, of course there are, but there's a couple of things to bear in mind. Number one is with Microsoft's approach is your data is always your data wherever it is. So if you're interested in that, you can go and look under Azure Security, and you can see, do a look up under Azure Security, and you can see all of the standards that we apply. One of the things to bear in mind is that companies like Microsoft, we've got a lot more money to invest in security than a school would possibly have. So we can bring a level of security to schools and to their servers and the workloads in the cloud that a school couldn't possibly afford in their own right. So it's worth thinking about that a school that's running their own servers, any server that is, or computer that's connected to the internet, already has a security exposure. Unless you're going to unplug your computers, which nobody does these days, completely from the internet, you already have a security exposure, even if your server is sitting in your school. So yeah, we like to think that we can bring a level of security to schools that they wouldn't be able to afford. And secondly, all of our data centers are now in Australia if you want to run your workloads in Australia. So if a school wants to keep their data here in the country, we have data centers in Sydney, we have data centers in Melbourne, and some new data centers coming online in different locations next year.
So if I'm ready to get started, I'm an IT administrator, where would you recommend I go, or how would you recommend I start to make sure that it's a smooth process?
Okay, so firstly I would go and just go and search for Azure and go to the Azure homepage, because we've got most of the resources you need to get started there. Secondly, if you look at TechNet or Imagine, look for Microsoft Imagine, there are tools to get you started and running there. And we also have a service, so when a school is ready to invest in Azure and get some workloads, we have a service that will help you to get your workloads up and started, get started with your Azure subscription and start running it. And that's somebody who will actually help you over the phone to get up and running.
All right, that's great. And any last wise words from you, Mark, on the Azure front?
So I think it's something that can be frightening if you haven't got into it before, because it seems so big, but the potential is so enormous. So my advice would be, look at some things that you're running, that you may be running in a school at the moment, that you think perhaps you could run in the cloud, and just have a look at some of those applications, things that you might be running, might be something like Moodle or one of those other type applications, and go to Azure and run up a virtual machine. So it's very easy to get started. Create a machine, might be a Windows server, might be a Linux server, it doesn't matter. And just see how it works, and we will be very quickly begin to realize that it's as easy to run something in the cloud as it is to run on your own server.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mark. That's been very insightful.
Thank you.